Our next speaker, Peter Robbins, is an investigative writer, author, and lecturer, best known for his UFO-related research, investigations, writings, and on-air presence as the host of the weekly radio show Meanwhile Here on Earth, Monday nights. He's a regular guest on blogcast and radio shows and has appeared in and served as consultant to numerous documentaries and TV shows. He's spoken at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., Manhattan's Juilliard School, and the city's School of Visual Arts, Boston's Cambridge Hospital at the invitation of Dr. John Mack, Cornell University, and the Our J National UFO Conference, Tokyo, scientific conferences in Athens, Rome, Milan, and Nice, the Royal College of Science and Technology. My God, he's done so much. How do we follow you, Peter? London and the universities of Cardiff, Hallam, Sheffield, Leeds, Hull, and the Summerhill School in Suffolk, England. Peter was a founding member of Bud Hopkins Intruders Foundation and worked as Bud's assistant during much of their 35-year-long friendship. He was event coordinator for the Sci-Fi Channel's Alien Abduction Phenomena, a symposium he organized to promote the release of Steven Spielberg's miniseries Taken, which is pretty cool. Advisor and consultant to the McMinnville, Oregon UFO Festival and the Experiencers Speak Conference in Portland, Maine. He's a co-founder of Travis Walton's Skyfire UFO conferences, and for 3 years, conference coordinator and advisor to the city of Roswell, New Mexico. Robbins was a deposed witness who testified at Stephen Bassett's citizen hearings on disclosure at the National Press Club in 2013, and is associate producer of the award-winning documentary Travis, The True Story of Travis Walton. He's also the producer, writer of the documentary The Extraordinary Life and Suspicious Death of James Forrestal, which those DVDs are available. You should get those today. Peter is particularly proud to be a co-producer of the Exeter UFO, New Hampshire UFO Conference, and we're really delighted to have him here. He's a great friend, Peter Robbins.
Thank you, Eric, for making up all that nice stuff about me. There was a time in my life before I became obsessed with this subject because of a return memory of a childhood sighting and the resulting statement from my sister about her abduction experience, that my only intention in my life was to become an artist. In that service, I studied art at university, School of Visual Arts, in New York City, where I became a faculty member. I studied graphics, children's book design, layout and paste up, unknown phrases in this era, and ultimately stayed in love with visual imagery for the rest of my life, even though I haven't been a practicing artist for some years. This talk is really more a labor of affection than something strictly academic. Most of my presentations are rooted in 20th century history, and they're pretty damn serious. Here, though, what I had observed was the science fiction imagery that goes back, for many of us, more than we think, to the 20s and 1930s, helped to inspire that first wave of UFO-related imagery in books and publications and magazines. And then when we started seeing books on space travel, rocketry, we see how these different groups influenced each other. This is, again, more a romp than not, but there is some solid information in it. And for those of you to my right who can't see me, that's a good thing, because you'd rather see the images on screen, even though you haven't seen them yet. The first one I want to show, I have particular affection for. It's from Germany. It's over 100 years old, and it's a depiction of the future. I love the fact that often when we see these great pictures in the world of science fiction, or images, or sometimes captured in film, they are futuristic. Some of them are absolutely visionary, but to the limits of their imaginations, the artists' imaginations, based on the cutting edge of science and technology at the time. They got it right, but, well, here we go back to the 1920s, and I mean, what can you say? The images that they generated are so imaginative, and in a simpler time, so fun, frightening, like watching a scary movie on a certain level. Not just a flying saucer, a visionary flying cup and saucer. In some cases, really daring in terms of color and layout. This is a favorite in that we can sense that people on this ship are in real trouble. It's sort of like, you know, an image of a flying saucer in The Day the Earth Stood Still. In Earth versus the Flying Saucers, 1956, where, thank you, Ray Harryhausen, we have a flying saucer crashing into the Capitol Dome, something that many of us might applaud at this moment in time. But it just sort of sticks in. It doesn't explode. Again, we're still late 20s, early 1930s. Again, just for sheer imagination, which is really what all of these images are about. Now, the inside story here, and this is 1920s, this craft has lassoed and pulled this skyscraper into space. The skyscraper is the Woolworth Building in downtown Manhattan. At the time of this image, it was about 10 years old and the tallest building in the world. Nice. This is an image of a spaceman from a British anthology from about 1937 or so, and not a terribly daring image. There you go, a man from space, circa 1937. War of the Worlds. Some of us forget that this book was published in the United Kingdom in 1899, and the original story is set in England. In 1938, the great Orson Welles, who had a weekly radio show called the Mercury Theater of the Air, most of you know the story, adapted the story for an American audience. It was actually rewritten by a great screenwriter named Howard Fass, and it's set in a town in New Jersey. And Fass, in interviews, asked why he set it there. He said, "I have a map of the United States above my desk. I needed a location. I closed my eyes, and I went like that. And Grover's Mills, New Jersey, is where the Martians attacked." The broadcast caused such a stir with some people that CBS actually had to apologize to their listening audience, who, despite the fact that there were commercials, which there probably wouldn't be during an actual active invasion of Martians of Earth, and that many weeks were collapsed into, I think, about half an hour, it was noticed by the authorities in terms of how a broadcast can affect folks who allow their imaginations to run wild or don't know better. And this panic, which was a lot more minor than it's been reported over the years, became a rationale in certain later declassified government reports for not telling the people. The book, H.G. Wells' work, I think, is copyright free, so there have been many editions of it since. This one of the more lurid. 1940s, beating the hell out of a robot. This is a visionary future of AI, possibly. Fate magazine was published in response, the very first issue, to the Kenneth Arnold UFO sighting on June 24th, 1947, a week or so before Roswell, that kind of initiated our so-called modern age of UFOs. 1 year later, Fate christened its magazine, and is still going strong. And that is the worked up image that our very first witness reports. Not a full disc, but the back kind of cut away. Now we're getting more lurid. It is now the early 1950s, late 40s, and the comic book style is perfect for these renditions. Remember, 1947, this image, we have a kind of Rock Hudson looking Army Air Corps guy, or Air Force at this point. And because we are still riding high on having helped free the world from fascism, well, there's a Freudian error right there. Our protagonist's name is Vic Torrey. Get it? The Flying Saucer, the first novel published with a flying saucer in its title, written by an English author with about a dozen novels, half a dozen travel books, some other nonfiction books to his name. And it's a retelling with some changes of the story of an invasion from Mars, but the invasion takes place by rocket ship. However, it's 1948. We might as well use that term flying saucer somewhere because that sells books. Flying saucer is not mentioned anywhere in this novel. Now we shift gears. This is the beginning of kind of the golden age of publications of books around the subject. And in this case, hold it 1 second. Major Donald Kehoe, graduate of the Naval Academy before World War II, a Marine, a highly decorated United States Marine pilot, who wrote, I guess it's not the first, it's the second book that really made the bestseller list in the United States, and it still holds up. I think you could say that Kehoe was our first celebrity-level writer on the subject. Name that doesn't ring a lot of bells now, but Long John Neville, one of the great old talk show hosts, and several others started to have Major Kehoe on their shows, which helped drive book sales and make him an internationally recognized personality on this subject, but not one they were able to ridicule. Once again, for me, there's something wonderful about these graphic designs. You've got your assignment basically, but you're in the world of the unknown, the uncharted. And as an artist, you might try things or present things to the publisher that you would not previously had, because nobody had a mandate like this for the subject before an illustration. Gerald Hurd, a British writer who published the first UFO book in England, and a very good book it is, reviewing past cases, and absolutely free of ridicule or silliness. The next year, the same book was republished here in America with a different title and a different cover. And once again, although not maybe the most graphically daring, it's a very interesting and compelling image. Paperback books have a history of more lurid covers than hardbacks, as a rule, and we see how this transposes into the paper edition. Beyond the Flying Saucers was published in 1950. Frank Scully was a screenwriter who had been given information which we don't know the source. It may have been what we call classic disinformation, which is a very skillful mix of truth and fabrication. And it did refer to certain things that were not in the public realm at that point about the crash in Roswell, New Mexico, 3 short years earlier, including 3 beings recovered from the craft. It was a sensational national bestseller and highly debated and dismissed by many because, well, he's a Hollywood scriptwriter, so need we say more? One of my all-time favorite covers, the paperback of Behind the Flying Saucers, makes you wonder, does everybody go to sleep like that? And it's just a brilliant image. And may give you some new ideas for night clothing. Okay. Are they good or are they bad? Well, I think we have the answer right here. They don't look too friendly at all. And this is where the golden age of comics intersects the golden age of UFO literature illustrations. There are ever so many comic books from the 50s and 60s that run the gamut from fabulous silliness like this to absolute documentary accuracy in comic book form. Comparative publication to popular mechanics, and this was the next group of publications to get involved in the story. Publications that dealt with engines, machines, mechanics, flight. Everybody had an opinion, and because there is no absolute authority, one can say, prove me wrong. Also, some of these articles were particularly well written. There weren't no UFO magazines yet, quite. Poignant, right? Just, whew. I remember when I first came upon this illustration, I was just very moved by it. You can immediately start to pick at it or tell yourself stories or, good-looking woman or what have you, but the basic humanity is what comes through. Some of you may be familiar with the film, The Day of the Triffids. It's wonderfully understated. It's a black and white English movie. This is the paperback of it. And without giving away the story, the triffids are a plant form that have come via meteorite from outer space and are slowly taking over the world until we find out how to fight back. But once again, a very thoughtful image. Okay, this is where Kenneth Arnold, who had the sighting in the Cascade Mountain Range in June of 1947, tells his story. This is actually a book that was published in 1948, and then this is a 1952 edition. They're virtually identical, but I wanted to be chronological. And that eye-catching image. I've had his, Kenneth Arnold's granddaughter on my radio show a number of times, and you know, obviously a somewhat affectionate and biased point of view, but he sounded like he was a really decent guy who never backed down, never was intimidated or allowed anybody to make fun of him relative to what he had seen. Okay. Once again, back to the world of science fiction. And in this case, if you know your history of space program, this is 1957 dead on, because that was the year that the Soviets launched Sputnik and officially put themselves ahead of America in what was known as the space race at the time. And the idea of a fully articulated, alien-driven UFO checking it out, who knows? It could have happened. And I don't mean that facetiously. This Fate magazine, which really covered the beat and continues to on UFOs now, I believe, only in an online version, although I'd have to check that. This is a rendition of a photograph taken near a Coast Guard station that is an authentic photograph, the original, but that configuration became rather famous in the work simply because it was documented and the photo was not doctored. Right. This book was published in 1940 and discusses the possibility not just of, well, this was one of the directors, I think, of the Royal Observatory in London. So the author was no slouch, and he discusses some more basic issues of space, potential for the future, but he doesn't shy away from talking about the possibility of intelligent, articulate life in space. Again, this is 1940. Right. This is the paperback edition of War of the Worlds, taking advantage of the film that came out in 1952 or 53, which for me is just great science fiction. I like it more than the Steven Spielberg version, which was incredibly violent. And there's something about Ray Harryhausen's terrific UFOs. You can almost hear the noise in your head if you've seen the film. And without much fanfare, creating a very eye-catching cover. Remember, these books would have been in racks in drugstores and 5 and 10s around the United States. So, like buying an old record album, they want you to stop and look at that image. If you do long enough, you might buy it for 25 cents. Back to Major Kehoe, continuing, this time going back, reviewing old cases, and continuing another round of professional appearances on the best radio shows of the time that we're dealing with this, usually late night. Frank Edwards was another big name by that point, who became the most popular radio personality of his time, in part by having UFO witnesses on his show. And his death in the 1960s was cause for some conspiratorial thinking. He was a big guy, possibly had high blood pressure, but he died the night before he was supposed to give the keynote address for an international UFO conference in New York City. For me, always defer to the most boring possibility and work your way up from that. I've looked into the case of Frank Edwards' death, and it's still a mystery to me. Now, the UK, Britain, often known for a more conservative approach to these subjects, not necessarily. This is the English cover, and I think a lot more graphically jumping. Again, a paperback of then Mr. Kehoe's, Major Kehoe's latest book. Flying saucers have landed. George Adamski was probably the best known and most influential of the so-called contactee in the contactee movement. This began cusp of late 50s, early 60s with almost a precursor to the hippie generation. They saw these intelligences from space as wanting to come here to assist us. And the catchphrase was, "Welcome the Space Brothers." Naive, sure, but overall, not a terrible, philosophy. Desmond Leslie, who's credited here as the lead writer, went on to become an extremely respected science writer, both here and in the United Kingdom. And this cover, with the so-called classic Adamski-type saucer, became one of the most widely recognized images in the world of UFO publications. And on a personal note, I will tell you that in recovering my memories of my childhood sighting, which I was able to repress for more than 14 years, an event that took place with one of my sisters as a witness, that afternoon, I went to our village library on Long Island, a little village called Rockville Center, and I took out 2 books on UFOs, flying saucers. There were a lot in American libraries at the time. It wasn't really seen as something to be embarrassed about. It wasn't until the 1970s, and I don't know whether it was some word from the American Library Association or just a mass movement, where libraries started to dump their UFO books. And if you were lucky enough, you could pick them up at book sales right at that moment in time. For me, though, I was looking for a book that would explain away what my sister and I had seen. This was the last thing I wanted to know about, that somebody allegedly had contact with one of these. And I would have taken this book and the other book back to the library that evening had it been open. I took it back the next day. The only reason I tell you this is because that evening, and that evening alone, this book sat on my childhood desk at home. And my sister came into my room to find out if I wanted to talk about what we had seen that afternoon or that morning, to which I told her no when we spoke, and so we didn't for all those years. But when I asked her, after she told me her memory, if there was anything else she remembered that could confirm what I remembered, she thought, and she said, yeah, I saw 2 books on flying saucers on your desk, which was incredibly compelling evidence. They were there for one night, years before. And this was the book cover that came back to me during regressive hypnosis. It's not an easy one to forget. Once again, a science fiction immediately co-opts the Adamski-style saucer. Why not? Now we come back into the world of comic books, this one being a particularly documentary type comic book with real case after real case. these artists or the writers for them really did the homework. Flying Saucers on the Attack by Harold T. Wilkins. A graphically very powerful cover for me. And the title is somewhat misleading. It's not pegging these visitors as necessarily violent or hostile. It was like kind of co-opting the term the flying saucer for that 1948 novel. Let's use the word attack. It's more provocative than, but it was kind of an analysis and a thoughtful one of the phenomena to that point. Willy Ley was one of the German scientists who helped the United States of America with its fledgling space program. And at the time, in the late 40s into the 50s, it was almost always assumed that whatever went into space, that first rocket to the moon or something, would just be a scaled up version of the V2, which caused so much havoc and death in England during World War II. And here we have, again, a high contrast, high concept cover that has a vibration of these earlier ones. There's a cover. Mysteries of Space and Time also deals with the possibility of UFOs visiting from parts unknown, and with the possibility of life on other planets. For me, what grabbed me most was not the content, but the cover. It's printed in such a manner back at a time where there was nothing holographic or jumping out at you that gets in your face. It's not a subtle graphic. At this point, the flying saucer, or UFO, is now comfortably sliding back and forth between science fiction and serious ufology. Flying Saucers in Common Sense, first published in England, is actually a terrific primer on the subject, on what seems to be going on, and is probably at the time was a very good book to loan a skeptical friend, because it didn't pull its punches and there was no way to really come at it and make fun of it. It was serious from start to finish. Flying Saucers Uncensored, once again, goes back into the history to that point, case by case by case, also dealing with some of the claims of ancient astronauts, which at this point were just beginning to be explored, and certainly not fully until the mid-60s kicked off Eric von Daniken's career, and that idea of ancient visitations became part of the way we accept things overall. Cedric Allingham, another leading figure along with George Adamski in the contactee movement, and we see he is visited by a similar saucer, makes contact with the man from outer space. And for me, it's complete nonsense and unbelievable. But, the catchphrase here is prove me wrong. Leonard G. Cramp, a scientist who was interested enough in Adamski's basic claim to want to see if he could figure out how this object, which may have been a fantasy or not, might have actually been configured mechanically, and what its power source was, etc. It's very creative in he's assigning all these possibilities and all these very scientific-looking schematics based on nothing but his imagination. Who's to say is wrong, and at the same time, who's to say is right? But I thought, once again, a respectable, eye-catching cover. Here we meet M.K. Jessup, Dr. Morris K. Jessup, a PhD, I believe, in archaeology, who had studied ancient civilizations in South America and became interested in the UFO subject in the early 50s and wrote a series of books on it. He was a very fine writer and a great researcher. It's got to be 15 years ago, one of those rare times where somebody said, I want to commission you to write a paper to give at a conference. I rarely have that situation. I usually say, here's 10 topics to choose from. But he said, I want you to look at the lives of well-known people in the field whose deaths are suspicious. Jessup at the top of the list. And I thought, oh gosh, this is such conspiratorial sensationalism. But I needed the job and I took it, and had quite a few surprises, including about Morris K. Jessup, who does seem to have taken his own life. And like suicides having nothing to do with this subject, it's often a very complex matter that brings you to that terrible point of despair. And at the same time, it can be one event. I had to come away, as Stanton Friedman used to say, that's in my gray box, pun intended. I haven't made up my mind about it, but a wonderful writer whose work can still be read today and appreciated. It's aged very well. And back to Major Kehoe again, who comes back with a book called The Flying Saucer Conspiracy, where he postulates that the government may be withholding things they know about this subject. Imagine. His thought being, and it's one that is still put forward, the potential for mass panic. But at the time, the idea of a government conspiracy to keep this information under wraps was still a minority view. Same book, British edition, cooler title, cover. Right. Now we're into the world of serious space science, but with a cover that literally jumps out at you. And for me, at least design-wise, somewhat informed by some of the covers we've seen here that have nothing to do with space science. Martin Caidin, a space writer who created a very, the artist that did the book, a very powerful image, I think made more powerful because we are looking up at the protagonist. It's a filmatic technique that usually lends extra credibility to the figure in question. And that fabulously creepy green. Ruppelt was a Air Force captain who, for a period of time, was put in charge of Project Blue Book, which officially was the Air Force's coalition of reports and investigation into them. We now know it was much more of a public relations project to make it look like they were really doing something, which they weren't doing much of at all. By 1967, even with 15% of the sightings completely unexplained, the Air Force essentially said, nothing to see here, folks. it ain't happening. Ruppelt knew otherwise, but of course was kept from saying all he knew for obvious reasons. But this was an incredibly popular paperback book when it came out. I think it actually hit bestseller status, and it was all these cases laid out for any reader to see that there were problems with the Air Force's final evaluation. Aimé Michel was one of France's leading ufologists. This was his first book to be translated into English. And it's just a damn good book about everything that was going on in France and to a degree Europe up until this point. He also wrote a book, I think I have the image coming up, Flying Saucers and the Straight Line Mystery, which was an analysis of a number of visitations where you could plot the places where these craft were seen, photographed, or left landing traces, gun sight straight, that for whatever reason, they were moving in an absolutely straight line for whatever. The Coming of the Saucers, great title, English, and I honestly don't remember the content of this except going over the best known British cases at that time, and respectfully. So, M.K. Jessup again. This was the first UFO book that dared to ask these questions. And in some cases, in some corners, it was not a popular book. How dare somebody even bring up the subject of these silly fabrications with the Holy Bible? But Jessup really did a marvelous job of looking at certain passages, certain stories in the Bible. For me, the one that jumps out even as a young person was Ezekiel. And unfortunately, it was never reprinted. It was only issued in hardcover. But if you can find a copy of it, it's still extremely readable and daring in terms of asking the questions that it does. The Earl Nelson, a titled Englishman, wrote this book, obviously with a point of view on Mars, in the late 50s. And you know what? It's a terrific book. It lays out everything that we knew and thought we knew to that point about our studies of Mars. It probably was the first major book on the possibility of life on Mars since Sir Percival Lowell's book from 1906, which was discussing the alleged canals on Mars, which really, under higher magnification, they're not there, although it would have been wonderful to think that they were. Anyway, one of the things that caught my attention as a history buff, and this is the back of the book. He wasn't kidding around. Whatever side you saw told the story. The Earl Nelson was the great-great-grandnephew of Admiral Nelson, the most famous military naval hero of the 18th century in the United Kingdom. One of the great paranoid classics of all time. They knew too much about flying saucers. The first line in the book is to the effect of, one by one, all of the flying saucer researchers that are out there now have been silenced. Gray Barker was a character with a capital C who kind of rode this point of view. The Men in Black, he was the one to come up with the phrase, and the big cover-up, and the silencing of witnesses. It's an entertaining book in kind of a creepy way, but it's got a great cover. Fate once again, and another report, and another great graphic. Man into space. 1960, and one of the first books written for regular folks, although it has some technical aspects, about this beginning dream. This is really right before President Kennedy's announcing that we would go to the moon by the end of the decade. Flying saucers with another variation on the theme. Flying Saucers was a magazine defined, and I'm being kind here, by low production values. It's newsprint. If the ink ran, so what? It's not fully registered, but here we can see it's not a good day for the Brooklyn Bridge. Doesn't get more all-American than this. Fate again. Fate covered a lot of territory in terms of the paranormal, the weird, the strange. And it's likely that if you had a serious interest in the UFO phenomena and you saw in larger script, "I have seen zombies," you might not think it was the most credible thought. Okay, the expanding case for the UFO. Once again, M.K. Jessup simply adding more scholarly information, more reports, more analysis to the record, so to say. And pretty powerful cover, I think. There we go. Once again, high contrast letters, big concept graphics, and colors that jump out at you. This was a privately published monograph. Leonard Stringfield really is the godfather of the serious study of alleged crafts and recoveries of UFOs. I was lucky enough to meet him in 1987, and one of those people who just radiated enthusiasm for what they did. And I was not a real presence on the scene at the time, to put it mildly, but when I chatted with him at his sales table, he simply invited me to come sit down next to him and talk for about half an hour. And I thought, he didn't have to do that. You know, of course I bought a book, but I thought, if I ever become somebody in this work, remember to be nice to people. It's not a big deal. It is a big deal, but it's not difficult. Space power. And space weapons. Aren't we ahead of ourselves here? 1960, 1961, somebody's thinking ahead. It's chilling. Coming to the later 60s, and now we're pretty much out of the golden age of illustrations, but I wanted to carry on a bit more. Also, it's sort of conservative, and at the same time, it's hard to forget. For me, books like this are particularly interesting because we see how different the imaginings were from what really exists today, even if it's with that just one simple illustration on the cover there. Spacesuits evolved in a very different way. Okay, a British publication coming out of the Flying Saucer Review. Might just be the longest running journal on the subject since it started publishing. Flying Saucer Review is an English publication that has published a few books, and this was one of them. The annuals, not surprisingly, covered all the significant cases across the United Kingdom to that time. Willy Ley again, one of the great German rocket scientists, and the ubiquitous V2. Our whole space program began, as some of you know, with German scientists brought over under Project Paperclip, some of them with former Nazi affiliations, but the forces that be felt they were too important to be ignored or to be left for the Russians to grab. And so they quietly were named American citizens, put to work, and that craft is the basis of everything that came after it in our space program. Whoa. Okay, 1959. Again, flying saucers, ink a little bit sloppy, but not a cover you'd turn away from immediately. Gotta love this one. Howard Menger of New Jersey, probably as well known and as popular a contactee movement person as we have, in this book describes his life with the aliens and having met an Earth woman who reminded him of the space woman that he had loved, I think, on Venus. He also, he recorded a record of songs from Venus and Mars. I'm not familiar with their musical history on those planets, but I sensed an accordion more than a very Earth instrument that I recognized. That is Howard's painting, and the charming title, From Outer Space to You. It's a lovely, once again, we've got a modified Adamski craft there. Kehoe's latest at that point. The Sky People was written by the Earl of Clantrety, a titled Englishman and a member of the House of Lords. I had one degree of separation from him. This book, by the way, is very scholarly and really readable. He spends a lot of time talking about stuff that wouldn't be discussed for some years after, again, by Eric von Daniken, the possibility of ancient visitations in different civilizations. And he makes a very compelling case of it. In 1980, the Lord Earl of Clantrety put a motion on the floor of the House of Lords that they create an event to look at the subject of UFOs and flying saucers very seriously. And because of that, my first mentor, a retired gentleman at that time, but during the war, he was a staff officer in the Hungarian Royal Army in charge of all visual analysis of images and audiovisual education of the troops. And he had become a leading figure in the 50s, 60s in the work. And Clantrety asked him to work up a position paper relative to the seriousness of this subject and the military implications. And Major von Kavetsky, my friend, asked me to edit the paper. So I got my name on something that appeared in the House of Lords. This book, 1960, this is a hardcore Air Force dismissal of the whole subject. The author, handsome gentleman, very serious, spends the whole book explaining away every single UFO sighting to date anywhere in the world as explainable somehow in some terms. We know that because, of course, we know that there are no such thing as flying saucers or visitations to the planet. It's a book filled with self-confidence and not to be taken too seriously. I included this only because when the Space Needle was built, they were promoting it, and we see kind of color combinations and layouts that are reminiscent of some of the books we've seen. It was obviously considered a very futuristic structure, and still is. Again, early 60s. The author of this book was the chief science writer for the New York Times at the time. So this book was taken quite seriously and was fairly courageous in taking a position that this was, these craft and visitations were not out of the question. The great Jacques Vallée, one of his very first books about the enigma, with a rather enigmatic book cover. And the paperback. Frank Edwards himself, again, a well-known radio personality, championing this subject and having UFO witnesses and authorities on his very popular late-night talk show, wrote several books. Every one of them, I think 3 books, was a smash bestseller in the United States. Flying Saucers Serious Business, Flying Saucers Here and Now, and a book on other kinds of mysteries. This book, for me, it can be pretty dense reading. It was written by Dr. Carl Sagan and a Russian colleague before Sagan became the famous Carl Sagan that we know. And it's a pattern that we sometimes see with great thinkers, where they dare to think and write about subjects that later in their development, their life, when they are now well known, they feel a bit awkward about, that they like to kind of shove behind the scenes. In this book, I thought that Sagan was particularly courageous in championing the view that we may well have been visited, unlike his later public stances, which dismissed this overall as nonsense and wishful thinking or just dreamy. Yeah. And once again, a second book by the Earl of Clantrety, Brinsley-Le-Poor Trench. This one dealing more with contemporary sightings and the possible science behind it than his first. Stranger at the Pentagon came out in the 60s and alleges that an authentic alien in human form named Val Thor visited the Pentagon and briefed Pentagon officials on his experiences, his race, his visitation to the Earth. For me, it's one of those books that is really best relegated to the realm of lore and myth. Who am I to say that it didn't happen? But I've never seen anything evidentiary or even circumstantial that suggests to me that he was a real person or a real being, or that this happened. Nonetheless, a popular book. Carl and Jim Lorenzen, founders of NICAP, the first really serious UFO research organization in America and the precursor of MUFON, were a married couple and a phenomenal pair of research investigators. I hold them in the highest esteem, and they really explored and pioneered a lot of work on the subject that folks who came after them were able to build on. Again, flying saucers on the attack, a very jump out at you cover. And even just mentioning, or invaders, that had to sell extra books. Albert K. Bender was the UFO researcher who, at the time, Gray, who wrote the Paranoid classic, was focused on. Bender was the one who really coined the term Men in Black that Gray Barker picked up on and made into, well, something so popular, it's like Little Green Men, Men in Black. It's a catchphrase that stays with us. And this is the paperback where he is discussing how he was made to keep quiet. This book, Ivan T. Sanderson, Uninvited Visitors. Sanderson, going back to the later 30s, was a biologist who wrote about big cats and what's going on in the Amazon, who became very interested in UFOs with the inception of the subject in 1947, and wrote 2 terrific books about it. This one made publishing history in that insert that you see in the center, that's a die cut out of the book, and glued onto the actual cover is a hologram of a UFO. The first time a hologram was ever used in publishing. And I think this was 1967. A great writer, by the way, very readable. One of many books coming out in the 60s that took a very positive view and reviewed the cases, American writers. Aliens in the Skies, John G. Fuller. That name should ring for some of you, especially if you're local. Fuller was the journalist who tackled an analysis of the incident at Exeter, which we are marking the 60th anniversary this weekend here. And thankfully it was him who wrote the book called Incident at Exeter, and not a lesser writer who put this place and this story on the map. Here, he continues his work, and once again, a author whose writing hasn't suffered with time. It's still highly readable. Back to Dr. Jacques Vallée. And back to this great series of comics. They were published by all of the major comic book companies. And this one, as I recall, is also actual case histories. Imagine if you're, adolescent, you're a comic consumer, you can pick up another story that you know is a fantasy or a comic book about the real thing. They sold well. And sooner or later, many famous comic book artists decided, with the okay of their publishers, to go forward. I'm very proud to have an old friend, Sal Amendola, we went to art school together, who for several years drew the Archie strip. And as he told me, he was let go sometime after he included, in a normal Archie strip where you're always in like 1942 and everybody is a virgin and everybody's having a good time, that he had drawn a small flying saucer in the sky of one of the frames. Bye. I'm proud to say I have that on my wall. More true stories in comic book form. Very interesting book. Vesco was kind of a military science writer and talks about the different policies that governed the American military regarding this phenomena. At the other extreme was Harry Truman, who put out a standing order at a certain point in his presidency that you fire on these things if they don't respond to a conventional radio message. A very good book. Joseph Blumrich was a systems designer for NASA, systems that went into our various rockets. And a friend of his, as I understand the story over dinner or some social conversation, talked to him about his impression of Ezekiel and how, if one looked at it in a non-theological way, it seemed to be a discussion about this craft that came down, this being that came out. And Blumrich was so incensed that his friend took this seriously that he said, "I'm going to prove you wrong." And he carefully went over Ezekiel and realized that his friend was right. And that based on the descriptions in Ezekiel, Blumrich designed the craft that you see here. And I don't know another book like it. You can probably find it online for a couple of bucks. Whether or not you are a person of faith or an agnostic, doesn't matter. He makes his point and he makes it well. Dr. David Jacobs, one of our best-known abduction researchers, was probably the first person in academia to receive a PhD based on the story of UFOs in 20th century America. Dave, retired now, an associate professor of history at Temple University in Philadelphia, who taught regular history classes, but for something like 18 years, taught a class on the history of UFO reports and claims in the United States of America. I think Temple University must have had a real internal conflict about Dr. Jacobs doing this. Probably there were academics and members of the faculty and folks who were on the board of the school who felt this was embarrassing, that it could draw ridicule to the school. However, they never dropped the class because it always filled up. It always made money for the school. But the way they got back at Dave was they never allowed him to matriculate to become a full professor. 18 years later, he was still an associate professor, which is, thank you very much, but kind of an offhanded insult. Anyway, his PhD thesis was published as a book in the 70s, and this is it. This is, again, well before he was involved in any abduction research. A very specific case, obviously, in a very particular location. For me, one of those covers that just grabs you, and you know, if I wanted to nitpick, I'd move a few things around or change the dynamic or the width of a line, but works for me. Whoa, now we're into different territory. There are all kinds of UFO researchers, and a number that I've interfaced with and had debates with are Christian fundamentalist UFO researchers who know and enter the field knowing that all of these UFOs and flying saucers, they don't come from other planets. They're manifestations of Satan's minions, that they're demonic, and that to pay any serious attention to them is to be led away from the true teachings of Jesus, which unfortunately is something that some people take seriously. And I think the author also had a book to the effect of To Hell and Back on a Flying Saucer. I, again, with mutual respect, debated a number of representatives of this group of thinking years ago in a series of debates in Roswell, New Mexico. I liked them as people. They liked me because I was honest with them, cordial, straight up. But anytime I would bring up something that I felt could prove my point, like, even in the old early Hubble telescope days, we have ever so much footage of, a classic example would be some little object moving through space, as boring as it could be. It could be a weather satellite, it's moving too slow for a comet, and then it just goes like that. And I'd present that, and the response would be, Satan watches all the same television programs we do and knows what we're being told, and in every case has the, way to get around it. As Tony Soprano would say, what are you going to do? I don't even remember what this book is about, but it's got a great title, cover. One of the early contributions to the Ancient Astronaut School, this time by a French author, and a good job it is. Ray Stamford. We lost Ray about a month ago or so. I think he was in his 90s. And he and his brother did a great job of what I would call a hyper specialty kind of book, again, about the cover-up, about their personal involvement with UFOs, became kind of an elder statesman of the subject, and met with a lot of folks, lived in the Southwest. I have two colleagues who were good friends of his and helped mentor people in the work, and was one of those folks who, like me, encouraged people to build their libraries. The information is there, much of it is digital now, but a lot of us are always going to be old school, prefer reading books always to reading off of a computer screen, and if we have the space, build a library. Again, the great Jacques Vallée. Jean Michel, a British writer. The Flying Saucer Vision, for me, is one of those memorable books I have ever read about this subject, because it goes back to prehistory and discusses the English landscape, the ancient beliefs, the ley lines, burial cairns, stone circles, and ties them all in with ancient visitations, not exclusively, but to a degree, and to a degree that is really well researched and well done. I can't recommend his books highly enough. They're so enjoyable to read, and they're absolutely fascinating. I've been lucky enough to visit the United Kingdom, I don't know, I'd have to go through my passports, but 20 or 25 times, and I've had a chance to follow some of the leads that he put in my mind many years ago, and I've always held him at a very special place as an author. And a more updated, a more modern version of the Gray Barker Classic. Speaks for itself. All of these books are contemporaneous with von Daniken. He was the one that really set it in motion, and that guy has probably sold 400 million books plus worldwide. But it ignited the interest, and most of us do take it seriously now. It's naive to think that things got rolling in 1947. Okay, another book, and once again, a modified Adamski-type saucer and a memorable graphic. and actually a wonderful writer too, who wrote about a great deal of aspects of the paranormal and UFO studies. The Fire Came By is a book about an enduring mystery. In 1908, something either crashed into or exploded over Siberia with such force that it leveled miles of forest, miles and miles, and flat out in directions that have only been mimicked by a direct strike of a comet or a small nuclear test. And this book explores the subject. One of the theories is that, and it's based on eyewitness accounts, even though this is like reindeer country, there ain't nothing going on, that a cylindrical looking object moving through space exploded, and it irradiated the area in a way that was not seen again until the meltdown of Chernobyl. And it's still an open subject. The Soviets had sent several missions in to explore the possibility. Much of it's still not released as far as I know. And one of those stories I find absolutely fascinating, that I buy that possibility. The other thing is that it was a crash of matter and antimatter. I know so little of physics, I don't even know whether that's a funny joke or that's possible. But whatever it was real, and it was amazingly destructive. Paris Flamand, another of the French writers whose work was ultimately translated into English. Situation Red, another book by Len Stringfield about crashes and retrievals. This was a book that was one of the first published after I became interested in the subject, and I remember just grabbing it. This appearance of objects over the Capitol building in Washington. History should have changed completely at that point, but we're sleepwalkers in a way, and we buy whatever the media will tell us if that's more comfortable for us than a potential truth. Australian publication, Australian book. And there are a number of publications that discuss technical or technological aspects of trying to catch images. And in the old days of, chemical photographs, this was a very good primer on the subject. Okay, there's a cover for you. Raël began as a French-Canadian journalist who got touched by the spirit and became the earthly representative of a civilization from space called the Raelians. Interesting name. And developed a cult, a friendly one. Most of the recruiters for the cult were very attractive blonde women with big busts. And I saw this book published in a magazine, and I thought, I need this book for my library. And it was the first time I had the guts to write to a publisher and say, hello, I'm a researcher on the subject of UFOs, and if you send me a free copy of your book, I will consider reviewing it. They fell for it. But what really got to me was the emblem of the Raelians. Essentially, it's a swastika superimposed on the Star of David. Not too provocative, right? Well, somewhere along the line, the Raelians decided to update their emblem. And I don't know if I have it here. Yeah, There it is, the original. Whew. As a Jewish person, I have some problems with that. They turned it into a pinwheel. So, fun and games. Yes, Carl Jung got involved in the 1950s, and he wrote a very Jungian book about the subject, that these are obviously kind of a collective aspect of the imagination of the public longing for a new pantheon of gods to save us from ourselves and the damage we are doing to Earth and to ourselves. And that they might be real machines from outer space as well. But it's great reading, especially if you have an interest in human psychology. It's fascinating. Again, Jacques Vallée, great title and great cover. The Andreasen Affair by the great Raymond Fowler, who also wrote the book on the Allagash abductions. Who cares what's in the book? The question is the thing, and I'm concerned. A book for children, but readable by adults, of the 1897 airship mystery, of some credible accounts of a pre-Wright brothers kind of dirigible that was observed. You know, think of the greatest scenario of some eccentric millionaire working somewhere like in Texas and having technicians create this airship just to freak people out. I really think it probably was something like it, but there's a lot of information on it, and it does seem that it's based on a reality. Missing Time. One of the most important books in the canon of specialty literature on the abduction phenomena. This was the book that first put Bud Hopkins on the map. It is a case study of 7 individuals, as I recall, and observing for the first time patterns that people who have had these experiences share. Hilary Evans, great English writer, Incident at Pascagoula, Charlie Hickson, and Calvin Parker. Clear Intent, the first book dealing directly with a hard assessment of a cover-up in Washington about the UFO situation. I think published in '87, but it was unflinching, and 2 very fine researchers and authors. Jenny Randall's a very prolific British researcher. And Richard Hall, a PhD and specialty in pilot sightings. One of the most significant books ever published on the subject, also 1987, the great Timothy Good. If it fell off a table, it could kill a small animal. It is filled with absolute documented information on the opinions of the leading figures of the last 100 years, really. Well, since the event started to happen. Many of them leading government officials, military people, essential to a serious UFO library. Publication cover in England, the incredibly influential Whitley Strieber's book, Communion. This is Bud Hopkins' best-selling book, the one that was made into a miniseries by CBS in like 1992. I don't think it was ever transposed to DVD or anything like that, but it runs for free. You can find it on YouTube, Intruders. The print is bad, but the drama is credible. Richard Crenna, Mare Winningham, Ben Vereen, and Susan Blakely, a very pioneering effort to bring the subject of abduction to television. Bud's Intruders went into I don't know how many languages, but working for him at the time, and with rare exceptions as a volunteer, when a new translation would come out, I'd get a copy of it. And again, we come around once again to Jacques Vallée, a novel by a writer named Steven Spielberg. Great Timothy Green Beckley, an old friend, gone now. And I think we're going to end here. The Roper Survey Company, funded, I think, with a grant from, of all people, the Crown Prince of the small kingdom of Liechtenstein in Europe, Hans Adam. It is a survey that went out to thousands of people about their possible paranormal experiences or UFO experiences. And the survey was written in such a way, as a long survey, that no question directly asked that question. But when it was analyzed, the percentage of people, of Americans across the board, that were convinced they had such experiences was considerably higher than they anticipated. I don't remember what the percentage was, so I'm not going to guess at it. But UFO cover-up, once again, the paper version of the 1987 book, Vallée again, and a lesser known but a wonderful researcher and one of the more graphically memorable covers we've seen. Without Consent, the first book on abduction to be published in England, 97. And we are out of time. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Please join us at 7 o'clock at the beautiful historic church next door for a jazz concert that I think you'll really enjoy. Buy raffle tickets. See you in the morning.